The Texas Tribune reports a woman who crossed into the U.S. at the New Mexico border seeking asylum has been separated from her disabled grandson for 10 months now. She's currently in El Paso, Texas, while her grandson's at a state-run center in Connecticut. The author of this article, Julian Aguilar, is an immigration and border security reporter for the Texas Tribune. Joins us now from El Paso, Texas, right there on the U.S.-Mexico border. Good to see you. This is a hard story to read, a very sad story. Can you kind of encapsulate what happened here to this woman and her grandson?
Certainly. Well, it was one of those stories that had not been reported, and an immigration attorney who I reach out to on occasion said that it was a very unique case because this woman is from Brazil, as is her grandson, who's special needs. He is apparently suffering from severe autism and epilepsy. And she was threatened in Brazil for exposing the school that he went to, so she sought asylum here. And apparently this was in August, so this was well before the zero tolerance policy was initiated. And she was processed in El Paso, and so was he, but then he was eventually separated from his grandmother. Now, the attorney in question, Eduardo Beckett, says she's not the perfect client because she had been removed about 11 years ago because she had worked on a tourist visa. But he said that, you know, she had spent 10 years away when she was only required to spend 5 years away. But this goes counter to the claim that they are only separating family units that cross in between the ports of entry, which I think was the underreported story here. And as the statistics that you pointed out earlier, the administration began its zero tolerance policy in May. But the statistics released today from the Department of Homeland Security date back to April 19th. So I think that people are starting to realize that this policy was in effect even before the announcement was made.
Yeah, I want to talk big picture, but let's quickly try and button up this case.
Sure.
What happens to this child if she's deported? His caretakers in Connecticut have called for her release, saying that he doesn't have any other good options. His parents are out of his life. So what happens to this young person?
Well, the way I understand it from Mr. Beckett, the immigration attorney representing this woman in the case, is that she's fighting for her asylum claim. Obviously, everybody knows it's very hard to get an asylum claim based on threats of violence. So she's fighting for that. But if she is deported or denied, then he's going to stay in custody of the state government until he's 21 years old. And after that, it's a mystery about what happens to him afterward, because they're required by law to have custody of him because of his disability and because he's got no other caretakers until he's 21 years old. And he is 17 years old now. He crossed when he was 16.
You, at the beginning, said this is a unique case. So do we think this is a one-off, or do we actually think there's a massive other thing happening here different than what we've been led to believe?
I wouldn't feel comfortable saying it's massive, but it's certainly not an isolated case. Again, there's evidence from this attorney that's saying that there are women in the same detention center that crossed at the port of entry instead of between the ports that were separated from their children. It's hard to get confirmation on these cases from ICE or CBP with such a short turnaround. So I would not make a bet these numbers are as vast as the unaccompanied children that are being separated in the statistics that we're updated with earlier today. But I don't think it's a completely isolated incident. I think it's likely happening a little bit more than some people might realize.
Okay, and last thing, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but the weeds are important because the details are determining people's lives right now. Is the situation that if you come in and you go to a recognized port of entry, the distinction is whether there's some reason that you would be turned away? In other words, should we understand that this woman's case and those like her are because she had this checkered immigration history, and that we don't have evidence of it happening to people who don't have that type of immigration history?
That's definitely a great question, and you're right, it is sort of wonky and in the weeds, but that's exactly what's hard to tell, because without comment on this specific case, again, reaching out to CBP about a comment for special needs migrants seeking asylum, or just this case in general, they said, as a blanket policy, you come to the port, seek asylum, no family separation. You go between the port, we're going to prosecute you, which inevitably leads to family situations being separated. But with this case in particular, there was no clarification on whether or not it was because she had a prior removal. Because again, and I have the documents provided by the attorney's office that said she voluntarily signed the form acknowledging that she could not attempt to re-enter or be present in the United States for 5 years. This was in 2007, so clearly she had surpassed that by almost 6 years, and she didn't try to re-enter again until August of last year.
I want to try to get to two more things quickly here. On May 7th, Jeff Sessions says we're going to institute this policy as a deterrent. Is there any evidence, or maybe we just can't tell yet, whether it's working as a deterrent?
That's another great question. You know, the crossing statistics for May were recently released, and they showed that the folks they keep coming. So I think there are three general issues here on whether or not the information is not trickling down to the folks that might cross, whether or not they're being misled by the smugglers, which in the government's defense does happen. You speak to people down there that say that the smugglers so they sell them a bill of goods, and when they come down here, it's obviously not the situation. Or whether, in fact, the situation is so dire in Central America, mainly Central America, that they're willing to take the chance anyway. I was at an immigration shelter in Ciudad Juarez, just across the river from El Paso here 2 days ago, and the woman in charge there says she posts the news articles. She says, hey, look, this is what's going on. Go at your own risk. But again, these are very small numbers still to be able to generalize that it's having a deterrent effect. I think maybe within the next month or two, we might be able to tell if there are fewer folks coming and whether or not that's because they know that they're going to be separated once they try to cross.
So then the question is, what happens to these kids? And your publication is now reporting the Trump administration has selected a site for this tent city they've talked about to house these immigrant children. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. This selection was confirmed Thursday. And the site is Tornillo, Texas, which is a small outpost about 20 miles east of the El Paso city limits. And it's home to a very, very large commercial port, but it's got so much space that I'm assuming this is why they chose that. And it's actually up and running as of this afternoon. We got confirmation from a state representative here, a Democrat, Cesar Blanco, who requested information on when the construction would be completed and whether he could take a site tour. And he told me just a few minutes ago he was blindsided by the fact that it's already up and running. According to his office, there are about 100 people there, 100 unaccompanied children, and the capacity is, I believe, about 365 with the ability to expand. So what happens to these children is they'll either stay there or maybe get let out to some sponsors while their parents' case winds through the courts. But as we also know, earlier this week, the Attorney General said that most claims of asylum based on violence or domestic violence or gang violence won't be credible enough. So I think there's a lot more reporting to do for us in the next few months to see exactly what these new changes are going to have, what effect they're going to have on the ground, and what happens to these folks that are seeking safety here.
And those are the type of cases detailed in your story from the woman in Brazil, Julian Aguilar, from the border, working for the Texas Tribune. Thanks so much.
Thank you.